Hello, viewers, fans, and friends. 89er here. First stream in a while. Hoping that all is well out there for over the last, I'd say, 6 months. I've come to a new understanding of how to deal with the low end tracks. And I wanted to share a quick video about some of the things that I've learned and some tools that I found that helped me much better understand what was happening in the low end of my tracks. And it's forced me in my new productions to completely change how I think about it. And I think I'm getting much better results, surprisingly better results. It's made a surprisingly huge impact in the way my tracks sound, how much loudness I can get out of them without distortion, how well they compare tracks even up on SoundCloud that into a glossy format. And it's really a combination of a couple of things. I was really experimenting hard to understand why some of my mixes didn't translate very well out into other. And I've been crazy about trying to do reference tracks and work with referencing in the past, but had never really gotten comfortable that I fully understood it. Then I had a chance to listen to my tracks in a friend's car, and he's a former car stereo guy. He had this, really great subwoofer system built into this car, and we went and heard my tracks, and, well, they sounded straight garbage. They were terrible. And the low end was just so overpowering, and it sucked all the life out of the rest of the track that suddenly you could hear it well. Now, in my studio, I have pretty decent setup. I have some VXT8s, and in theory, those go down to, the roll-off is somewhere around 35,000 or 40,000. 30 or 40 hertz. So, in theory, I should be able to hear the low end, but it was clear that I wasn't. So a couple things happened. Number one, I did add a subwoofer to my system so I could hear what was happening down in the low. That in and of itself was incredibly informative and immediately told me that I was not paying enough attention to what's happening down there in the low end, and specifically, obviously, the kick and bass were kind of building up on each. But secondly, there were some concepts that just hadn't really driven home. And as I was playing with how to fix this, I ended up experimenting with much shorter kicks. And I realized that the kick and the bass, right? The kick really is just the pulse beater, right? It only sets the pulse. And the bass is a little bit more of the musical melodic instrument. Now, of course, there's always a big debate. Which one do you want to control? You could say, oh, I want the bass to control this track, or I want the kick to control this track. All that's fine. But for this, for dance music that's got a heavy low end to it, it's incredibly important to try to figure out how to balance that kick and bass together. So in the researching that and thinking about it and experimenting, I had done a couple of things where I set up some tracks and I was trying to see how short a kick could be before it didn't sound like a kick anymore, but just sounded like a transient. And it turns out right around a 16th note, at about 120 BPM, obviously because the 16th changes depending on what your BPM is, but right around that 16th note-ish range, your kick drum starts to convert from just being a transient, just the click and the punch, to then having a little bit of oomph down in the bottom end of the kick. But if you extend much further than the 16th, then suddenly you're kind of eating into the bass territory. So in my new tracks, I was really experimenting with shorter kicks. Then I ran across this YouTube streamer called Baphometrics. And Baphometrics, if you've never seen the YouTube channel for Baphometrics, BAFPH, I'll link it in the never seen Baphometrics, go spend a couple of minutes watching videos that are put up on that channel. It's unbelievable the level of detail they go to, and the thought that goes into them is really amazing. So it's worth a couple of minutes just to go look at that if you're interested in thinking about the low end of your tracks. For me, it made a giant difference. Now, on my new tracks, I'm of course working these concepts in, and Baphometrics has this interesting idea called clip to zero, where instead of, in a nutshell, instead of just leaving all the dynamics in all of your tracks to then sum up to a fully dynamic master that you then squash with a limiter to try to get sort of competitive loudness out of it. And of course, I know the loudness wars. And by the way, I agree that you want to leave dynamics in your music, right? That being said, I also recognize that if you've got a fully dynamic track that simply hits at, say, minus 11 lufs, when it's out there playing against tracks that are minus 8 lufs, it's going to get the next button immediately because it's not going to sound as present as the louder tracks. So I do think there is a balance there, and irrespective of the fact that Spotify and some of the others are starting to normalize, which I all think is actually pretty good, as bandwidth increases and as our ability to distribute this stuff across the various mediums increases, all of that's kind of going to go by the wayside at some point. So I think Bathymetrics has a really good point, which is master your stuff up as clean and as loud as you want it to make the sound of your track what you want the sound of your track to be. And he or she, I'm not even sure if Bathymetrics is a he or she, but they're arguing that at the end of the day, when you bring all of this together onto the master track, you shouldn't bring it all in spiky. You should go ahead and limit it on the way in and use clippers for it. It's kind of interesting. It's a neat argument. I've been integrating it into some of my stuff as well, and frankly, getting some pretty good results. But today's video, with this huge intro that I just dropped on everybody, is all about reworking an older track. So I'm going to play you a couple snippets of an older track of mine. This is a track called It's Logical, and it was off of my second album when I was first starting to produce. And it gathered a little bit of some interest from some folks. Now, we're talking very small numbers here. I'm an independent producer. I just do my own stuff and just put it out on SoundCloud and a few other places, use TuneCore for distribution. Never seen any big numbers on anything. But every now and again, when you're playing your tracks for your friends, one track stands out. People go, ooh, I like that one. That one's neat. And I was fortunate enough that some folks compared this to kind of Robert Miles, and which was neat for me to think about some folks like that. That being said, I always knew that my tracks just weren't really cutting it, and so let me play a snippet of the older track. And this is It's Logical off my second album, and I'll just play a little bit of it to set the flavor, just so you understand. And again, this is the one that, this is one of the standouts of my early stuff, which probably doesn't say a lot about the rest of my early stuff, but neither here nor there. So take a listen. So you can hear it's kind of a moody piano track that's got this melodic content on the top, and you can see that I'm classically trained, so you can see I was thinking about how to lay this out in almost like a classical type development with introduction, then development of a theme, introducing a new melody, and exposition to kind of maybe play with the two together, throwing in a break, a second melody return, etc. But the track is it's kind of dark and moody, and it had a kind of a flavor to it, but still a little driving and kind of dancey. But if you listen to the low end of that track, really left a lot to be desired. Now, at the time, it was kind of the best I could do. And it was, me working on some really crappy monitors, especially this track at the time. I had some really, really bad equipment. So I was trying to do things by listening, but also by watching. And just listen to the very low end. right? At first blush, it doesn't sound horrific. It's definitely kind of muddy. But you could still hear the kick, and you can still hear the bass. At first blush, that's not totally horrendous. But when you start playing the sub and you get down to the very low stuff, it's almost just sustaining one note. It's almost just one big long boo. Now, I don't know if you can really hear that across the YouTube recording right now. So I don't know how well YouTube's going to be reproducing that. But when I put it on the subsystem now and I listen to that track, and I'll this comes from the Dead Mouse masterclass. He at one point in his masterclass said, most people, when they make their kicks and you play them in a club, the club just goes the entire time. And I kind of get it now, because that's exactly what this track does if you throw it on the system with a sub and turn it up. The low end literally just sustains one big, heavy, low A, and it never changes. Now, what I've learned is that now that I'm working with my low ends differently, number one, that problem goes away because you don't have this big, giant, sustained low end when you sort of hear it, because of course it doesn't make sense. Now, I also discovered a really cool tool that it turns out that Baphometrics also uses, and it's called oscilloscope. And oscilloscope it's an oscilloscope, and it allows a really, really useful feature here. And you can see the way I've got it set up, where you got the bass bus, the bass group track, and the kick group track coming together into one oscilloscope, so that you can literally see the kick and the bass as they are playing. So the bass is up here, and the kick's hitting in the bass, and the kick and 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 the bass. And I can't do this for my older track because I've already reworked it in this live set. I probably should have done that, where I looked at the oscilloscope view of the older track to compare it to the new one. Now, what I've done with the new track, though, is completely reworked the low end using oscilloscope. So here you can see this nice big kick that's sort of triangular shaped and coming down, and then the bass filling the gaps in between, which, rather than just using a compressor and doing side chaining, I actually used an LFO ducker with a curve similar to what Baphometrics had suggested to try to sit these two together. Now, if you do take the time to go watch the Baphometrics videos, they're incredibly detailed, and Baphometrics spends an inordinate amount of time analyzing and talking about this portion right here of going from where your kick and your bass start to come together. And it's super fascinating to go see, and if you can see, for example, where these waveforms are crossing each other, if I put this in layers, these waveforms are crossing each other, Baphometrics is pointing out that when you have moments like this, you're out of phase. So you're going to have little phase holes in your sounds. Now, in my case, all that stuff is so quiet as it transitions from the kick drum into the bass that I'm not too worried about it. And it's actually, there's not too many instances where I have to worry about it. But Baphometrics does some amazing videos to talk about that level of detail. Now, I'm more interested in the musical side of it, so for me, it's about whether or not it actually sounds bad and what to listen for things that sound bad, which was very helpful. Now, let me go back now, bring this back to the beginning. I'm going to start the track in the old version, and then I'm going to immediately convert it over to the new version so you can hear just what happens when you clean up the low end of the track, because it frees up all the other sounds, because it changes how all of your effects end up working. It changes your downstream compressors, it changes your downstream limiters, it changes your mastering limiter, it changes everything about how the track sits, and it kind of gives you a much bigger a much better option to control the overall sound, but how much it breathes and how much stereo image you have and all that kind of fun stuff, because you don't have all this energy that's, just sucking up down at the low end. So again, here's starting with the old track. And I'll jump around a little bit here. So. This is the new track. And for those that are on headphones, you might say, wow, some of the low end went away. And the answer to that is yes, some of the low end did go away because it really didn't belong there. And if you listen to production level tracks, which I'll do a quick reference in a moment, you'll find out in your headphones that they don't have that low end either, because if you did, you'd end up with a totally blown out low end like this track used to have. But you can hear so much more definition in the individual elements. So I'll A-B right here. Old track. New track. Old track. New track. Now, it's not like the new track doesn't have low end, right? We're sitting down here at 55 pumping away. Now, here's the old track. You can see this lump that's just sitting here, not going anywhere. In the new version, right? It's much more flexing up and down. So what this has done for me is made me realize that I should go back and look at, rethink all of my old tracks. And really the steps that I took in reworking this were, I looked at my kick and said, okay, is this kick actually created the way that will lead to a good sounding kick for the type of track that I'm trying to make it sound like, what I'm trying to write. And what I found when I looked at the kick that I had, I think, if I'm not mistaken, well, I don't have that sample handy. Again, it's in the older version of the project. But what I had was a kick that was sustaining almost what was a tick over an eighth note, right? Whereas now I'm a tick under a 16th note. And that kick is nice and crisp. And it's got some character. It's not like it's just some plain old kick, right? It's got a little bit of character to it. And I pulled it out of a set that comes with Live and did some EQ work on it, and I've got a little channel EQ to make it not so bright, because I didn't want it. This track's supposed to be a little moody, so I didn't want things that really kind of snapping out, if you will. But that kick, which is so short like that, then allows for kick and sub to work with each other, not just create one big sustaining sound. So the kick hits and tails off as the bass comes in, whereas in my older version of the track, the kick and the bass were overlapping with each other, creating just one big low sustain note. So I looked at replacing my kick and specifically making that kick much, much shorter, and using oscilloscope to look at how that kick is sitting with the bass. The other things that I did were come on to the bass track And rather than just relying on a compressor to try to duck the kick, and Bathymetrics has an incredibly extensive video on the right curve for making your sub and your kick fit together. Although I do believe the video that I saw about the right curve in your ducker was really about fitting the top end of your kick with the sub of your kick. So, having the click and the punch then marry up with the sub of your kick. In this case, I'm ducking the sort of sub bass, if you will, out of the way of the kick. And this track is it's a little bit messy because it's my older stuff, but this track has both a low bass and it has a top bass. So that snappy bass sound sits on top, and then you got a low bass that's kind of laying down the groove, if you will. And so for the low bass, rather than use the traditional ducking waveform, which kind of comes up this way, I adopted a slightly amended version and kind of headed towards what Bathymetrics suggested as the kind of curve. And frankly, it sounds kind of nice. So I'm working with that and trying to work it in my set. So, replaced that kick drum, went to the actual bass and threw in a ducker rather than just relying on a compressor to try to get bass and the kick drum not to conflict, which of course, depending on your track, you then have to think about automating that ducker in and out, right? Because if your kick drum isn't necessarily all square on the floor, all square 4 on the floor, you might end up having to automate the ducker out if you want the bass to ring out completely when the kick isn't playing, for example, right? So there's some things that it changes about how you might go about your production. But so after replacing my drum sample, thinking about how long that drum sample really should be, and then replacing the bass, then thinking about putting a ducker on the bass, frankly, it changed the whole sound of the rest of the track, and I had to kind of go back through and rebalance the track in order to get some of it to sit right, because now there was all this room that wasn't there before, and the effects that I needed in order to try to make it sound right weren't necessarily the same. So I'm going to play some of the back half of this track right here. I'm going to A-B the old track versus the new track. And I want to thank everybody and anybody who came along to view, or anybody who's viewing this afterwards. I appreciate it, and I'm probably going to end up doing a few more streams about some of these concepts because I am super excited about the way I'm reorganizing some of my tracks right now and thinking about how to make the low end work better. And it's just been such an incredible discovery, and some of my tracks are sounding they're sounding so much closer to what I'm trying to make them sound like in my head that it's gotten me excited to even go back into my old library and think about replacing some of this stuff. So, thanks again for being with me today. I hope that you enjoyed. Here comes the little break out as I play out, and I'll A-B back and forth between the old track and the new track. And hope everybody has a great day. Old track. New track. Old track. Old track. can hear in the old one this like muddy overtone that's just gone.